Now, let me introduce to you David Holm, CEO and founder of Exigen Group. David is a qualified KPMG ACA and provides commercial direction to Exigen's global clients. He does that by drawing on his experience of being a board director on more than 50 organizations and have been in the industry for a long time. For Exigen's clients, he helps identify growth opportunities and has a great track record of getting top and bottom line results. Please do tap into his knowledge and Susan's knowledge and expertise during the webinar with your questions and even after this session. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Gordon, and thank you for everybody who's attending the webinar from all around the world. It's great to see you here. Can I just introduce Susan Wortzmans, whose passion is information governance, well, I believe so, and long distance running. Susan actually owns and runs Wortzmans, and one of their key areas is information governance and e-discovery. Susan, just out of interest, e-discovery and information governance, are they the same thing? Are they complementary, or why are they two focus areas?
They're completely different, mostly because e-discovery is generally a reactive process where organizations get sued, they need to produce records, so they have to go through an e-discovery exercise, which is reactive. Information governance is proactive, and organizations who have good information governance strategies, practices, are really instead planning for that ahead.
Okay, so there is a commonality.
The commonality and the way in which they're complementary is really because of some of the technologies that are used for both, and of course they both relate to how to manage your information. You need to manage your information for both e-discovery and information governance.
And this is one of your passions, I believe.
I would not have called it a passion. I might have called it something else.
Okay. So just really kicking off with some a scene set, really, because this is a hugely interesting set of stats that you've collated and that you work with. So just out of interest, why is this such an issue?
You can see from the slide in front of you, 4 main reasons is that the volume is huge, and I'll talk about that. In terms of volume, to managing, for organizations, managing the legacy data that they've been compiling for decades is unmanageable. Technology isn't used as well as it can be, and we'll talk about that going into this session. And trying to solve these problems on a piecemeal basis doesn't really work. So the volume...
Talk to me about some stats, though, because I'm just a humble accountant.
The volume is amazing. The more data has been created in the past 2 years than in the entire previous history of the human race. So that's staggering, and then think about that going forward, how much more information we're going to be creating each year as that multiplies. Data is growing faster than ever before, so by about 2020, it's estimated that 1.7 megabytes of information will be created every second for every human being on the planet. So what does that mean? By 2020, accumulated digital data will grow from 4.4 zettabytes to 44 zettabytes, which doesn't sound like a huge growth, 4.4 to 44, but 44 zettabytes is actually equal to 44 trillion gigabytes of data, and gigabytes is probably a term that we're more familiar with.
Well, we sort of are, but it still seems an incredible number.
Tens of thousands of records in a gigabyte. There can be.
How many in a gigabyte, typically?
It depends, because it depends.
That's a lawyer's answer. But
it depends on the file's type.
Right.
If you've got a
give me a range.
10,000 records in a gigabyte.
So
on average.
I won't actually do the math for 4.4 zettabytes, but that's an awful lot. And what do you attribute that to specifically?
Well, just the number of mobile devices that we each have. I'm looking around at the table in front of us, and there are multiple mobile devices on this table, and they say on average now there's 3 to 4 mobile connected devices per person, and that's going to grow. That's only getting bigger. So those are, and most of this information, we've got all these smart devices that are connected right now. So all of these devices create more and more data, and it's just accumulating.
Okay, so maybe we can move on to the next slide, Gordon. I think you kind of made your point. There's a lot of it, and I think the main point about this kind of webinar is what to do about it, really, and how to manage it. I mean, I think it's clear that everyone talks about big data. This puts it in context. So, Susan, kind of if you maybe look to this slide, what are the key points that you would draw out of here?
One of the difficulties in managing it is the volume. So what an information governance strategy does is it helps you reduce the volume. It helps you understand what information you have, where it's stored, who can access it, how you're going to deal with it, all of those things. So that's really the answer to that. Right now, we can see that information governance touches upon so many aspects of what we do in terms of risk. So I guess in the challenge part, that's one thing I didn't talk about. The risks are legal risks, privacy risks, in addition, the risk of a cyber breach, which has become a very important, significant factor for so many organizations.
So can you just elaborate a bit more about the difference between cyber breach and legal risk? I mean, they're quite different concepts.
Yeah, the legal risk can be either the risk of litigation and what records do you have, what records you're going to have to produce in that litigation, or a regulatory matter. And those are legal risks. So you need to respond to a regulatory audit or inquiry. A cyber breach is a completely different type of a risk. That's a hacker coming into your environment and taking your information and either making it public or using it for their own business advantage.
And so does internal breaches, employee breaches, where does that fit in the context of the Panama Papers, for example?
It's a breach as well. It's in that spectrum. It's not a third-party hacking, but what it is a situation where somebody comes in, an employee has access to information that they probably,
or a temporary employee.
Or temporary, but has access to information that they probably shouldn't have had access to given the amount of information that was released, and they're able to share it with the outside world.
So in a sense, your central proposition here is getting rid of records reduces risks. I mean, it's as simple as that.
That's part of it, yeah. And the other part of it is knowing what you have and where you have it and who you're giving access to. If the right people, and only the right people, have access to your crown jewels, the key corporate assets and information, you're far less likely to have any type of breach.
There is a fantastic stat here, though, which is this $250.
So the $250 stat is what on average an organization pays for each record that's compromised. So if you have tens of thousands of customers' client information, their name, their address, their credit card number, because they bought something from your shoe company, and you have all that information and you have a breach, you actually have to then respond to that breach, and you've got to notify all of those people. If you aren't retaining that information because you have no business reason to retain it any longer, and to comply with privacy laws, potentially, you shouldn't have had that information.
So what would the cost of the Ashley Madison breach be? I mean, I'm sure you weren't on
I think the tab.
Yeah.
I think the tab is still running right now on that one, because there's class actions, there's lawsuits, and there's the response team that had to go in. So I don't think anybody's been able to quantify that yet. So we look at average statistics of what breaches cost. Another interesting statistic is the fact that there are about 1,500 breaches worldwide a day right now. So that, they're happening all over the place. So there's a huge number of breaches, and some of them are very insignificant to an organization, and they may be able to remediate the problem, and others are public relations disasters.
Okay, so maybe we can move on to the next slide then. So that, I think, Susan, you've made a pretty strong case that this is a challenge. I don't think anyone's going to deny that the costs are astronomical of not addressing this issue. Why don't we start to think about what now? right? So that's all very well. You've won the argument. Thank you very much, Susan. Wonderful. What now? So
well, the
where do we start?
challenge, the problem is, you know, you hear those numbers and you think, oh, this is staggering. We have the organization I work in has terabytes of data, email, loose files, structured data, unstructured data. So organizations just say, you know what, we can't deal with this. It's too complicated, or there's no business value to doing it. There's no ROI to doing this. So I'm just going to buy more storage and leave it there. And frankly, storage has become cheaper now. And I can just store more data in the cloud, so it doesn't really matter. So that is what I call project paralysis. And I think the solution to that really is if your organization understands the business risks and they say, you know, we actually care about the business risks of keeping this information, then the key is to really taking a staged approach and to dealing with bits and pieces, finding the areas of information, the types of information that can be dealt with on a staged basis.
So
for example, one great piece of a staged basis is eliminate rot, which is redundant, obsolete, and transient information.
So can you possibly just give me a bit more, talk to me like my Labrador, ROT, tell me exactly what you mean by that.
Redundant, you've got duplicates.
So duplicates, okay.
That's duplicates. You have multiple copies of information. And we found when looking at different clients, we had one client who we went into and they had on average 17 copies of every single record. So multiple copies that were electronically stored in different places and paper copies as well of the same records. Right. So that's eliminate the redundancy. Obsolete, you needed it once, but you don't need it anymore. It's become obsolete. And transient, which is you never should have kept it in the first place. It was, David, do you want to go for lunch tomorrow? And you say, sure, Susan, delete that right away. And those are the transient.
People genuinely store that stuff, do they?
They're not storing it necessarily in their mailbox, but it's being stored on servers. It's being stored as backup. So all, you know, unless it's properly deleted and disposed of, it's being stored all of the time. We will look at information in e-discovery cases, and we will find endless numbers of emails about company office parties that are long over, and, you know, who's coming to the kitchen for cake for, you know, the wedding shower.
The cake challenge, okay. So let's just sort of, that's a really interesting overview. Gordon, if we could move on. I think the really interesting part of this, which I hadn't appreciated, was that your view is this is not a sort of technical legal challenge. It isn't an IT challenge. It's actually a business challenge. And I'm sort of interested in your views on that, which is where your starting point is, which is this whole idea of understanding the business.
Yeah, and the important part for developing a strategy is you want to engage the business units who create and own the information, because what you actually need to understand and what's critical is what's important to the organization, so that you can enable, if you know the important information, you can save that, isolate it, and you can actually assist the organization in making decisions that are based on their information and their data. So you've got to talk to the business units, figure out what is the data that they care about today, what's the data that they're going to care about in the next 5 years, and guess what? They probably don't care that much about all of the legacy data that they're storing.
Sure, but okay, so I'm a guy in commercials or sales, and somebody walks in and they say, we are here to talk to you about information governance, and literally I would imagine my eyes would glaze over. Explain to me, as the head of sales, why that's relevant to me. How are you going to convince me? Sell it to me.
The way you're going to convince the head of sales is to say, if we manage your information better, you're going to know more about your customers, you're going to know more about your sales force, and you're going to know more about your competitors. So information governance will give you the information that you need to improve your sales, and then you're going to get more money on commissions.
Right, so you're not really selling that to a salesperson on a risk basis, but you might be on for the commercial team. So you're not saying you can't store this because, you know, basically you're storing up problems. You're actually saying there's an opportunity there.
That's right, because you have to deal with it that way, because human beings are, in my view, many of us, are innately hoarders. And we want to keep the report that we worked on that was 2 years old, because I think if I have to do a similar report going forward, I need to keep that. It's this whole idea of knowledge management. And I want to keep that report. So everybody wants to keep everything forever. And what they're doing is keeping multiple copies of the same reports over and over again, the same emails, and so it's building up this problem.
Because it's free.
That's right. So just going back, though, to this understanding your business piece, if you want to move forward with an information governance strategy, you need to understand your business. You need to talk to everybody including records management, IT, legal, talk to that group. They support the information, but you actually want to talk to the real business units and find out what's important to them, how they use the information. And from that, what we do is prepare a report which includes information, a data map, which is not about where data is stored, but it's about how individual employees store their information within the organization, so we get an understanding of that. It includes a gap assessment, and then it includes recommendations about how an organization can move forward.
So if we move on to the kind of the starting point, Gordon, which we would call a playbook, there are probably 4 pillars to this, and maybe just some brief commentary on what these 4 pillars mean to you, because one of the interesting things that we see is there are lots of people with policies and there are lots of people with procedures, but they're only as good as, if they're not used, they're not that useful, if you see what I mean. So and people have got technology, but do they necessarily use it? So what's your experience in the marketplace?
You need to know what the existing policies and procedures are, because that will inform you as to what's not working, and you'll hear that pretty quickly. So that's what their policies are, sort of the motherhood statement. Procedures are the standards. Here's exactly how you're going to do this. And that piece is really easy. Developing the policies and standards isn't difficult. The technology to support the workflow is far more challenging and interesting. I know we're going to talk about that in a bit. And then the owners. Who owns this information? Who needs it? Who needs to have access to it? And what will work for them in terms of their team and the business information that they need to access?
So just to sort of put you on the spot for a second, what percentage of people do you see that have policies, procedures, technology? They have those 3. How many effectively implement that as a percentage? I mean, roughly. I mean, you work with some of the largest banks in North America.
Almost all of the clients that we work with have policies and procedures and technology, and they're implementing it. But are they doing the best that they can do? So we have clients that have 10 different types of technology for storing reports and emails, because different business divisions are doing things in different ways. And that's the problem, is none of those technologies are necessarily speaking to each other. So that's why an information governance strategy actually allows you to pull all that information together, and it's pulling it together in one place, which allows it to become more powerful.
And is that, I mean, this isn't really an advert for Wortzmans, but is that part of what you guys do? I mean, certainly we find ourselves on the back end in terms of processing the data, but in terms of advising on how to best deploy that resource, is that a key part to you?
Well, a key part is making recommendations as to what technology will work in an environment, and then here's some options of different types of technology that might work. So what we want to try to do when it's possible is not change everything within an organization, because you're going to have a rebellion. You'll have an employee rebellion. People don't like to do things differently. So we want to have, we want to use some of the same systems if possible, but sometimes build connectors to a larger information governance or records management system, so that all the information is pulled together into one repository, and it does become a more powerful tool for the company.
And that's what you and your team do?
Part of what we do, yes. Like it's all of those, the policies, the procedures, recommending that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly our view from an Exagen perspective is we see lots of these pieces in place, but absolutely no central thread and no central authority to drive them forward.
That's right. We've got clients that actually take every different piece of information governance and they split it up. So they've got one team working on the digital information and one team working on the paper, and they meet once in a while, those two teams. But what we try to advise our clients to do is to bring all of that information together.
Right. So just moving on, Gordon, I think if we look at just standing back a second, you still have to get endorsement to do this, because it's easy to understand that you might want a new marketing database, or you might want a new piece of whizzy kind of sales software, because you can see the ROI. It's tangible. It's easy to see. Talk to me about the ROI on this if you're talking to clients.
There's, I think, two ways that are really bringing organizations to the table. One is the fear factor. One is the risk of a breach, but the other one is the obviously cost reduction and managing information, giving it a competitive edge, business edge. The storage costs are not a huge priority for IT, for example, that has a budget, and they're finding cheaper and cheaper storage all the time, and they can just keep adding to it. So it's really, you really need to sell it. You really need a combination of someone who understands just adding more storage and compiling more information is increasing your risk. So I think the real sales factor is let's decrease the storage cost and reduce your risk at the same time. That's the combination of those two factors.
Right, so you're not so popular with Iron Mountain. I mean,
no, I'm very popular with Iron Mountain because Iron Mountain knows that this is the future, and Iron Mountain, for example, is building and creating digital systems for storing information because they know people are transitioning from paper.
But actually what you're recommending is storing less information. You're saying actually that
and managing it better, which is
managing information. Okay.
Yes.
So if you sort of look at that, it's easy to see what the cost is going to be. It's a number, like you can calculate that. How do you calculate the risk of not being in a compromised situation? Clearly, one of them is physically you store less information. But how do you calculate the kind of return when you're really talking about the fact that the likelihood of being sued is lower? How do you, I mean, is it $250 per record?
Well, some organizations don't experience that. The likelihood of being sued is really minor because there are certain types of organizations that have recurring class actions, regular litigation from clients. For those organizations, if they can reduce their e-discovery costs are staggering. So if they can reduce their e-discovery costs by having less information, it's huge. They know what a review that involves 600,000 records, they know what that costs. And if they only...
What does that cost out of interest?
It can cost
600,000.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right. And that, so just so I'm clear, does that apply to medium as well as large enterprises?
Absolutely. It depends on the nature of their business and whether they're going to get litigation or whether they may be having a competition bureau investigation. It depends on what the nature of the business. If they're in a highly regulated industry, they need to manage their information because they need to be compliant. So this is a big factor for compliance as well.
And I guess that challenge is getting bigger as more business goes online because you store more personal information. Is that a factor or is that irrelevant?
Absolutely. We're storing more personal information, and most of it's personal information that we shouldn't or don't need to store. So you go online and you buy something, and you get to check off a little box about whether you want them to store your credit card information or not. But when there's no business reason for them to have your credit card information anymore, other than they want to make it easier for your second purchase, how long should they keep that information?
So in truth, any online business, anybody that sells or transacts online has this issue.
Absolutely, because they need to be compliant with privacy regulations in different jurisdictions, and they need to know what information they have from their customers.
Right. So good. Maybe we just move on to the next slide. I mean, so right. So let's just assume that this is all correct and reasonable, and I think it's pretty compelling. I don't think there's any general counsel or finance director or C-suite that isn't thinking about this, particularly after scares like Ashley Madison, and the highly publicised stuff. As you say, was it 1,500 breaches a day worldwide? And that's unlikely to go down, let's face it. So let's just talk about some practical steps. What do you think? Where
first
to start?
thing
This
is
a massive challenge.
you need a
Gigabytes and
champion.
zettabytes.
You need a champion of this, and you need a person or a team of people, like a core team, who are going to say, we actually care about this and we want to move this initiative forward. And it really has to be a multidisciplinary team. So, legal's at that table, compliance, IT's at the table, the business units are at the table, risk is at the table. So you need all of those different people at the table. And I think you need one person chairing that group, so that making sure those meetings actually happen and people don't go back to their desks. Another interesting step that I've thought about is most of the organizations that we deal with who are really prepared to come to this table have already experienced a breach. And then they know what a headache it is, and they know the risk, and they know how much the board, the C-suite suddenly started to care about this information. So one thing you can do to get it moving is have intrusion testing and have some type of a simulated breach, so that you can quantify how well did my organization react in response to this breach.
Right. So that's a really interesting kind of perspective. You think the only way to convince people, not the only way, but the main way to convince people is to say, this is what it could look like? I mean,
Well, I think that risk and the negativity of that is a tough one. I think that, I'd rather be saying to people, look at the business advantage and the competitive advantage that you can get. If you know your information, if you're a bank, you have all this information about your customers. You know where they shop, you know where they spend, they have lunch every day because they're using their bank card to get their lunch at the food court. Have all this information about your customers. Why aren't you leveraging that information so you can identify those customers and you can attract them? You can retain them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, certainly we've worked with banks where they've got 12,000 contracts and they simply don't know where the counterparty risk is. They just don't know. And I think it's a really, it's a very challenging question to say, well, where is my counterparty risk? And the answer can't possibly be, I don't know, boss.
That's right. And so, that's a better sell to me, for someone to say, I need to have that information so I can actually answer when my boss says, what is the counterparty risk?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the points on here I'd like is define the ROI. Is that a kind of hoodoo kind of calculation? Is that a real calculation? Or is that a...
It's a real calculation in terms of storage costs.
Yeah.
It is, it's less quantifiable in terms of the legal risk and the cyber breach risk, but it's there.
Right. Okay. But your core recommendation is get that core team in place that understands the business and have a leader for that. I think we've got to...
And the other key point I want to make on that one is the last point, the be brave and eliminate the rot, is finding somebody on that team who will actually say, I will give the sign-off on eliminating these records, because this is where sometimes it gets very difficult, because people are nervous about saying you can go and you can shred those 10,000 boxes. I'm not sure exactly what's in all of them, but you can go and shred them, because you know what, they're 20 years old and we can get rid of them.
But the big challenge with the ROI calculation, of course, is calculating the return is basically saying we'll never have to pay this money out.
That's right. I won't have to pay the money to store the 25,000 boxes, and I won't have to pay the money for someone to review it in case I get sued, because it's gone. And it is legally defensible for me at this point in time to dispose of those records. I do not have any litigation. I've kept them for long enough for all the financial reasons I need to, and all the HR reasons.
And is reasonableness around the kind of time and process, that's defensible? I mean, Is that how it works?
Reasonableness is one part of that test. Looking at all the 14,000 multitudes of rules and regulations as to what you have to retain. We know those retention periods, so you comply with all the regulations, you retain records as long as you need to retain them, and then you dispose of them. And for example, transient, obsolete, redundant records do not need to be retained. You don't need to keep 17 copies of an email. So, just have somebody say, I can dispose of that information.
So let's have a look at, Gordon, if we could move on to, let's have a look at the IG Hero.
So a lot of the
I think maybe our team got a bit overboard on the agricultural theme. So there's Farmer Giles with his pitchfork. Explain to me the sort of the buck stops here attitude.
Well, it's the person who owns the project, and I think that person should give the project a name, and so that everybody in the organization knows what they're talking about.
And Eric.
And they name, Project Eric.
Right.
Project Farmer John, or whatever you want to call it, and that owner has the pitchfork and has the power to say to people, come on, I want to onboard you. I want your department engaged in this. So whether your roadblock is coming from IT, or your roadblock is coming from legal because they don't want to get rid of anything, or your roadblock is coming from compliance because they don't want to get rid of it. It doesn't matter. This, somebody who says we are going to get on board with this strategy, and and they'll talk to those people and find out what their needs are.
So in your experience, who or where are the typical roadblocks? Where are the most significant?
Well, they pop up in multiple places. So the IT can be a roadblock sometimes because of changing the technology and understanding the new technology. Legal can be a roadblock because they don't want to dispose of anything. So the roadblocks pop up all over the place. Business units are a huge roadblock because they want to keep everything.
Okay, but I'm going to keep keep you on the hook on that. Come on, where is if you were Farmer Giles or Farmer John, as you would say over here, where would you expect the biggest roadblock?
Typically, it's coming from IT departments because they're not part of the overall strategy, so they're not brought in early enough in the project, and they've put an infrastructure in place, and they want to defend the infrastructure because they're comfortable with it. They have the security in place, they can buy more storage to keep storing it, and they don't care about risk in the same way. So that's generally a roadblock.
So in other words, here's an interesting conundrum, right? You've got the legal department who wants to hoard everything, and you've got the IT department who wants to store everything. Who is it that really wants to get rid of things? Really? Like, where's the passion to reduce records?
In some organizations, it is legal and it's a visionary. It comes from different places. I've seen I've seen leaders of organizations and listen to them talk, and they come from different places. They can come from the IT department. It's just
coming back to your earlier point. It generally seems to be the people that have been stung.
It's generally legal,
right?
Who are championing the IG strategy.
So just moving on to talk a little bit about technology in the next slide. I think this is where the crossover really comes, and I think certainly what we're finding is clients are very, very interested in this concept, and then they're saying, okay, what technology?
Well, a whole bunch of different technologies usually, unfortunately. So there's lots of products that you need to connect pieces. So you need to know first the functional requirements of your client. So you need to know about how they want to manage their email. You want to know how they want to manage their records, like records management. You want to know about their archiving needs, their collaboration needs. Do they need to instant message between each other all the time? How do they collaborate? The ability for search and retrieval, hosting model. What are their multi-language needs, their support needs, their security needs, their control needs, so data integrity, disaster recovery. There's a whole list. So once you know what all those requirements are, and usually, well, always you're going to need IT to help you with that piece and business units, then you can start to look at what tools will work.
Right. So again, assume I'm a Labrador, and I'm an SME, and and I'm like, this all sounds fabulous, Susan, but, you know, I've got 500 employees and, you know, I sell online shoes or books or whatever. What do I actually, give me an idea of what I'm looking at here. Is that too simple a question? Because I think one of the things that stops people addressing this is just, when you talk about 8 different types of technologies, you're sitting there thinking, well, what does that mean?
It's not too simple of a question because organizations right now are using SharePoint to do a lot of this, which is something that they have, and it's not, you know, it's not a huge cost to them at all. But it's just how are you structuring it, and how are you using SharePoint?
Right, that's a critical point, isn't it? I mean, that's how you use the technology is much more important than the technology itself. Is that?
That's right. I mean, I'm talking to so many clients right now that are in the midst of this migration to Office 365, which is great. But we want to say, you know, stop and think about what you're migrating. Don't migrate all the legacy data that you don't need to keep, because you're just going to add to your problem. So you've got the tool, and you know, you've decided on the tool, and it's great, but it's about how you're using it. So I think there should be a lot more consideration into that migration process about disposing of information.
So you know, really what you're saying is that, you know, it's actually incredibly useful to have somebody that knows what's out there, that can guide you towards how to use it best, and that's what you guys do. And I'm not plugging you, but I do think that's a really interesting point, because if you're a C-suite and SME and you're faced with this kind of problem, you know it's a problem, you just want some simple answers. I mean, do you find that you get, what's your mix between big firms and SMEs?
Over the years, it was been very interesting, because some SMEs came to the table a few years ago, but just wanting the policy piece, because they want, you know, they weren't quite there yet to say we need all the technology as well. So they kind of got really into shape on all the policy piece. In terms of the holistic, for lack of a better word, the holistic IG strategy, it tends to be right now larger organizations and government organizations, because they've got the whip behind them. They've got decisions from privacy or people and others who say you've got to be compliant. You are a government agency. You need to be compliant. So that's, I think, who's coming to the table more right now. But it's really simple, and you know, for SMEs, it's easy for them because they have a lot of the tools in place. They just need the plan and the structure to it.
I loved your line there. Convince IT this is not a headache. I've rarely convinced IT that everything isn't a headache, but anyway, it's a different subject. It's a whole different webinar. So maybe we just talk very briefly about implementation on the next slide, Gordon. You know, sort of some very, very simple kind of, please don't make this complicated.
Start simple. Email's really difficult for many reasons. There's attachments to it. There's multiple copies. So start with something like file shares, which is much easier. Start with, you know, small pieces, small groups. Have a win. Have a very successful pilot project, proof of concept, and then roll out. So, you know, don't try to take on the whole world at the beginning. And so that's part of the planning step.
Don't
stages.
take on the whole world, or indeed IT.
Yeah.
So I think in the next slide, Gordon, we've got 4 critical things. Clearly, people can read this, but one of the things that struck me about this was it's not a headache. 5.32 million is a fantastic number. Is the average cost of a breach. That's a big number. And for any organization, the interesting thing is the cost of a breach is not necessarily dependent on the size of the organization. So a medium-sized organization can actually end up with a big bill, which is way outside, you know, disproportionate to their turnover compared to a large financial institution.
Because they weren't well managed, they weren't well organized, and they just kept compiling all the information that they shouldn't have. And then when they're breached, and they don't have a structure in place, and then when the breach happens, they've got too much information. That's what drives the cost up.
Yeah, so the Panama Papers is a perfect example, other than it was an internal breach, but a breach nevertheless.
Yeah, and it
which would
wasn't.
probably cost them their business, more or less.
That's right.
It's very disproportionate. So, Gordon, I'm going to hand it back to you for any Q&A and a wrap-up. We're actually slightly running against the clock here. Gordon?
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you, Susan. I think we can maybe squeeze just a couple of questions, if you don't mind. The first question we have is about what you've talked about, the core IG team, and about one person who champions the IG strategy. How do we best get the stakeholders engaged?
Talk to them and find out what their needs are, find out what they're interested in for their business unit, and then work with them on making that happen. So, you need to get this whole team of people together, get a group that have worked well together. Some success stories we've just recently seen are in response to a breach, the team that had to stay up together for 2 weeks and work around the clock to respond to the breach, that team of people were able to move forward and create an information governance strategy.
Have you found, just out of interest, that you need, the first step is to explain to these different verticals the relevance of this to them?
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, that's the key part.
And it's different for each of them.
Exactly.
It's different for each business unit.
Right. Gordon?
Okay, thank you, Susan. Thank you, David. The second question, I think, is also the final question we can really squeeze in today into this session. How do we convince the organization that it is okay to delete records, particularly without a document-by-document review before pressing the green light to destroy corporate records?
I think that's a really good question, actually, particularly how do we do it without going through every record?
We've had a lot of situations where organizations have come to us and said, we've got a plan in place and we have a list of records that can be disposed of, says records manager or says employee AB, but we want a legal opinion. We want a legal opinion that says it is defensible for us to do it. And I think that sometimes that's just what the organizations need.
And just as a lawyer, I don't want to put you on the spot, but does that legal opinion come with 84 caveats? I mean, do you literally,
It can't.
Do you feel confident saying, these categories records, get rid of them, or do you say, subject to the following conditions, here's an 8-page appendix? I mean,
these categories of records, get rid of them, right. Easy to do, and with some, this category B, you can get rid of them, and here's the risk associated with it.
Right.
And but it doesn't really have to be that complicated.
Well, we could keep going on this all day because this is your passion, obviously, as well as long distance running. Gordon, I'm sort of sensing that it's time to wrap up. I think we've taken people's time. Oh, blimey. And I believe, Susan, you generously offered to help people to take a look at this, which is the first step. I think that's one of the interesting things about this is just being able to have an open discussion without feeling getting charged for it is a first step, don't you think?
Yeah, and it's just that discussion about here's what the steps are. Get a good understanding of an organization and what might be a move forward plan. So. And
this is applicable across jurisdictions, right?
Absolutely.
Well, that's incredibly generous, Susan. So great. Look, I think I would urge people to at least take the first step and have a chat and put this together. But obviously Gordon's going to wrap up. But for me, Susan, thank you very much for your time. It's been fantastic.
Thanks, David, for having me.
Thank you, David Holm and Susan Wortzmans. Thank you for your time and everyone who joined us for this webinar today. And the recording will be available in a few days' time. We'll be sending you an email so you can watch it at your convenience. Thanks again and goodbye.